Hi there, I'd like to explain something I work on. These things are called ideophones. What are ideophones? Ideophones are sound effect words, like whoosh, thwack, bang. Except in many languages, they form an integral part of the discourse, of how words, phrases, etc. are put together into stories, utterances, the big picture building blocks of conversations and of human interaction. These ideophones paint, color, and bring to life this discourse. So, in many languages, what you have would be stories narrated, peppered with these sound effect words in effect throughout. Now, we have these in, say, English and many other Western languages. But to some extent, the linguistic ideology is such that they are not treated as an integral part of it. They're very light add-ons. In a number of the world's languages, they really are center stage in this. And without them, discourse, stories, speeches, accounts are less vivid, less imagistic, and, for the speakers, less eloquent. So, where do I work on these? I've worked a little bit on Turkish ideophones. In fact, I actually did a whole master's thesis on them. You can find my master's thesis in the description below. That master's thesis was effectively a psychology master's thesis, but within a linguistics department. So what did I do? I gave 20 ideophones from Turkish to English speakers and gave them 4 definitions in English. One that was deemed correct, the opposite of correct, something completely unrelated, and the opposite of that unrelated one. Best I could do. It's not easy to do, to create such stimuli, but again, you sort of do the best you can, approximate, try and keep it consistent, and there you go. So what happened? English speakers, being given this forced choice task, i.e. they had to choose one of the 4, they chose the correct answer not so randomly, above chance, basically. That means, hedging your bets, you could say they were able to guess the correct meaning of these ideophones above a chance level. Therefore, there's some support for the idea that these words are what you might call iconic. So what's iconicity? Iconicity is the property whereby you take the form and the meaning, you look at them and you see if there's any resemblance. If something is iconic, there is a non-arbitrary motivation for the way it is formed. So in the case of spoken language, there's plenty of iconicity in signed languages, and this is super interesting. But let's stick with spoken language for a second, because that's what I worked on. In spoken language, this would be a resemblance between how the word sounds and its meaning. And so I think reasonably enough, that if that is true, and there's some evidence for this, what we should see is that people can indeed guess the meaning above chance. It shouldn't be totally one-to-one. That would be bizarre, but you would expect some sort of pattern. That's what I found. That's what others have found. And so I concluded that there is increasing evidence, including my study, for the iconicity of ideophones. It's said to be one of their key properties. That's why I thought I'd test it. So I thought a next step would be, one, to look at this phenomenon in other languages. I started looking at Ecuadorian Pastaza Kichwa, an Amazonian language of the Quechuan family, so related linguistically to the languages of Cusco, for instance, and one of the languages that the Inca used, especially in the later days of the Inca Empire. But an Amazonian version, which was already studied and documented to be rich in these ideophones. So I looked at these a bit, helped document them a bit with someone I sort of consider an academic auntie, if you will, named Janice Knuckles. I have an interview with her, which you can also find in the description. And I think linked here, actually. Anyway, so with Janice, I'm looking at these ideophones, and they're super interesting, paired with gestures. She's described that very well. Other people have as well, fantastically. Imagistic, multimodal discourse, let's say. Anyway, I'm looking at these and I'm thinking, well, wouldn't it be interesting to see how these spread? Do idiophones, in fact, form family groups, or do they not? And this is also a question I had with Turkish. You have a big Quechuan language zone with various Quechuan languages all through South America, and in Central Asia, well, starting in Turkey and the Middle East, going eastwards. The Turkish languages actually originated in Central Asia, far to the east of Turkey, but let's say taking Turkish as spoken in Turkey as a starting point, because I did my study with that, you go eastwards. Can you see other idiophones in related Turkic languages, Azeri, Kazakh, etc., Uyghur, you name it? Are those idiophones present? Do they resemble each other? Are they related? Do they look like they were spontaneously generated in that form to meaning mapping just because there was a non-arbitrary relationship for the speakers? Or do those idiophones actually also have a sort of pedigree? Do they have an ancestral form? Are they similar in related languages? Could you maybe reconstruct a common ancestor for them, much as you would do with biological species or indeed language systems as a whole? Could you do such a thing? So you start by, do they spread? So I started looking at this in South America, and just in a recent trip, I actually looked at this in San Martin in Peru, in the Peruvian Amazon, high Amazon, which is sort of directly south, if you go quite a bit south, but still directly south of that Ecuadorian zone. It's sort of a slightly southern Amazonian Quechuan neighbor of Pastaza Kichwa. Would you find the same idiophones? And although more documentation is needed, I did seem to find some similar ones, some similar items. So this to me suggests that they are indeed spreading, or at least part of the language family. We need more information on that. But if I'm right in my hunch, it should be the case that these words do spread like wildfire amongst not just related languages, but also unrelated languages. And this is really the key to the puzzle. Does an unrelated language of the area, another indigenous language, or indeed Amazonian Spanish, do they have this inventory, we could call it, of idiophones? And in the case of Amazonian Spanish, it appears that to some extent it does. To what extent may answer the question. If it's only a little bit, that could be a sort of trickle in, and it could be sort of chance, if you will. But if further documentation shows that they truly do have a large amount of these idiophones, and that it's truly something productive that is used and recombinable in the language, dynamic in its system, then perhaps we have a case for this transfer. Why is this interesting? It's interesting because idiophones and iconicity in general as a human language property is something that you could say is deeply rooted in human psychology, in the sense that, for instance, form meaning mappings being non-arbitrary tells you something about the architecture or the cognitive biases of the human mind. Now, if it's culturally specific, then it says something about a particular cultural zone or pattern that gets lodged, as it were, in the system. However, if it's more universal across, I say more universal because nothing seems to be 100% universal. Many things vary based on geography, culture, etc. But if it's fairly universal, it could be said to be part of the sort of default architecture of the human mind, itself arising from a shared human brain, which we have. And one of those things, the debate in behavioral sciences that rely on culture, is to what extent is there a psychic unity of man in the old sense meaning human, so to what extent do humans share the same psyche, right, the same mind? And we could say, well, we share basically the same brain, so why shouldn't we share the same mind? And others would say, well, culture has a huge impact on mind, as in the mind generates culture, but culture also has this sort of effect back on the mind, a sort of feedback loop to where it creates the mind, but also is the mind creates culture, and then culture has an effect back on the mind. And this is sort of a tradition that I come from. I think there's great evidence for that. And it seems that you can go all the way from neurobiology, which brain areas are close to each other, do they have an impact on how senses even and other experiences are perceived and how they might cross-activate in the brain. You can further investigate clinical conditions related to this, such as synesthesia, and therefore, if these things are linked in the human brain, if these experiences and are linked based on the architecture of the human mind, can you go from that slight bias to creating whole parts of the language system that are not arbitrary, but have some sort of motivation to them? And can that tell you something about how we bring together the world, paint a vivid picture of it through these so-called iconic words, especially very performative ones, such as ideophones, which appear in these dynamic contexts of storytelling, of describing what's out there in the world in a vivid way. In effect, can we go from brain to mind to all the trappings of culture and show how they're all part of the same human continuum? That's why I enjoy studying ideophones. It's nature and culture, not in opposition, but as part and parcel of the same world we live in. I find it fascinating. I hope you found it fascinating too. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to check out all the links in the description, any videos that have popped up here, interviews I've done. Ideophones are a fascinating window into the human mind. I hope you'll agree. Ciao for now.